Hello, welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is Bill Mitchell, and Bill is a certified public accountant. He represents taxpayers in IRS collections, audits, and appeals, and the U.S. Tax Court. He has offices in Santa Cruz and San Jose, California. He's also been licensed to practice before the United States Tax Court since 1978. Bill graduated from Santa Clara University in 1962, and after his service in the U.S. Army, he worked at the Internal Revenue Service from 1966 through 1971, and has worked in public accounting from 1971 to the present. So, Bill, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you again for inviting me.
Okay. So today I've asked Bill to tell us about the process for appeals and tax court litigation after a tax audit. And when we do this, we're covering highlights of a complex subject, so we, of course, want you to consult with a qualified tax advisor about your situation. All right, let's sort of get into this. Okay, we have another interview that's online. You can find it under Financial Insider Weekly under past episodes about handling tax audits. So now the audit is completed. You don't agree with the IRS proposals. What's the next step?
Well, the next step is that you have the the right to file an appeal on the audit to the IRS Appellate Division, and usually that is accomplished by writing a formal protest after you receive a report from the revenue agent that says you have 30 days to respond. Mm-hmm. And that's another term that they use for the formal protest is the 30-day response to the 30-day letter.
Now, before you do that, what about the idea of having some sort of conference with the manager or whatever?
You can. In most cases, I think the agent probably has discussed that with the manager already, and usually it goes forward. Although I have had experiences where a case for complex reasons got sent back to the revenue agent, and then you met with the supervisor and were able to come to a middle ground to get the thing resolved.
Yeah. So I think, again, it may not be the same today as, I'm thinking of a particular instance, but it seemed to me that that the manager was interested in getting an agreed case, so that it didn't necessarily have to go to appeals. Have you seen that in the past, or what do you think?
At one time, I think it was that way. Yeah. I mean, I go back to the dark ages.
Yeah.
I was a revenue agent from 66 to 71, and right. In those cases, the supervisors or the group managers would be very actively involved in trying to get an agreed case and not have the thing go forward as unagreed. I think more and more, particularly in the field in which I work, that that's why I'm there. We've reached an impasse.
Doesn't feel that way.
It doesn't seem like they're going to get resolved.
Okay. So how does the process, again, come about for the formal protest? Maybe you can sort of...
Well, the agent issues his report, and with that report comes a letter saying that you can agree to the findings and sign the form that they send, plus they'll sometimes solicit payment if you want to pay the amount and do it at that time. That's kind of throwing up your hands and saying, we surrender and the service is right. Or if you have a legitimate issue or factual disagreement, then you write the formal protest. And as I say, this letter gives you a 30-day time frame to get that thing into the service. And to some extent, there is some latitude where the service will be, if it gets in a couple of days late, the appeals officers usually will say, okay, we'll still go ahead and allow you a hearing on the matter. So, and the other thing is that if you go to appeals, most appeals now are in San Francisco for taxpayers in this area, and but in some instances, for example, I try mightily to see if the appeals officer will be able to come to the San Jose office at one time we had an appeals office
Right.
in San Jose with, I think there were 13 appellate officers, and that was closed down, and so it makes it a little more difficult to traipse to San Francisco. But sometimes the appeals officers will be sympathetic to coming down to San Jose, and you can have the appeal with them on a one-on-one right in the San Jose office at 55 South Market.
Okay. So, what happens after a timely filed protest is sent to appeals?
Well, you'll hear from an appeals officer fairly soon, and they'll tell you that they've got the appeal, and they won't schedule an appointment right then. They'll mention that they've got it in their inventory, and they'll get back to you again to let you know a date and time, or they may say we'll send you a letter with a date and time. But generally, it's not immediate. It's going to take a while because they have an inventory of cases that they're working on. So you have to kind of take your place in the queue and then go from there.
Okay. So why would an appeals officer decide any differently from the findings of an original examiner?
Well, they can consider what's called the hazards of litigation, and those are elements that a revenue agent can't consider, which hazards of litigation being the probabilities on whether the service would prevail were the case to go to tax court. And in my recent experiences, what the appeals officers are now doing is they contact regional counsel personnel to find out what regional counsel thinks of the matter as to how strongly these IRS attorneys feel about going forward with the case, and to some extent that will color the appellate officer's decision on the matter. But appeals is supposedly an independent body, and the appeals officer can make decisions supposedly on their own. There was an old-time group manager that I knew very well when he retired from the service. He would contact me from time to time, and his big theory was that appeals officers can do anything they want to settle a case.
Yeah.
It's just whether they're going to be able to justify their position, and that's another whole concern that the service has.
Okay. So, are there hazards connected with going to appeals?
There is, in the sense that the service could possibly, or the appeals officer could possibly raise a new issue that the revenue agent didn't recognize, or direct the issue in a different way. In other words, you've been arguing it one way and say, no, we're not going to look at it the way the revenue agent's been looking at it. Now we're going to argue it from a new standard or a new position, and that can be a little difficult at times. But and then the appeals officer can possibly raise an issue that wasn't even raised by the revenue agent, just looking at the return and say, hey, the agent never pursued your business as a hobby loss. We're going to look at that, and maybe that's the first time the subject was ever broached in the whole situation going up to that point.
Hasn't there, this isn't another question, so hopefully not a problem, but hasn't the IRS come up with some procedures recently where basically they're saying that they don't want half-cooked stuff to get up to appeals, that they want the
That's right.
well-developed case?
Well, that's an interesting point, because there's two ways to look at that. The way I interpreted it initially is that they wanted the agents to fully develop a case before it ever got to appeals, so that the appeals officer wouldn't be doing the revenue agent's work. That's how I interpret it.
Yeah.
My first experience with that in dealing with a revenue agent was that if you don't give, the revenue agent came and said, if you don't give us everything that we need, then we're not going to let you go to appeals. And that took me aback, because I hadn't heard of that interpretation, but they were saying that was that particular revenue agent's position. I think that the agent has backed off from that now, but that's how the service was interpreting it, or at least their agents were understanding it. So I guess it's still a little bit of a muddled theory on just what's what with respect to that.
Okay. So are there glitches in the procedures that can arise between the original audit and the right to go to appeals?
In what sense?
Well, that's your question. So, yeah, think you were referring to letter audit situations.
Oh, I mean, yeah, well, there's certain, the glitches that can arise is that when you go to appeals, not every appeal is in this area is directed to a face-to-face meeting in San Francisco. I've had some cases that, because of the heavy workload the service has, they've been farmed out to Denver, and now you're in a little bit of a different mix when you're dealing with that. I had one very successful resolution to a case with an old-time appeals officer who unfortunately retired a couple of months ago, but I enjoyed working with him very much. And then we've had another one that's gone to appeals, and the one thing about talking on the phone on an appeals case is a little different circumstance. When you're across the table from somebody and you've got documents that they can see and you can go through them together, but when somebody's on the phone, you don't know what they're looking at. Maybe they're looking out the window, and they've already made up their minds, and so telephone appeals circumstances can be a glitch where you don't really feel like you've gotten the full understanding and thoroughly explored all the issues, and boom, now if you don't succeed in getting a resolution at appeals, the next step is either tax court or pay the amount due.
Yeah. Can you give an example of how a case may be settled based on the hazards of the litigation?
Oh, sure. You can have a case where, I had a case once where the agent had set up issues and lettered them all the way. There were several issues, and they lettered them all the way from A to M through the alphabet. And when we sat down with the appeals officer, we went through them one by one. There is some humor to some of this, because in the very first issue lettered A, I thought we had a very strong, very strong position. And the first thing the appeals officer said is, the service has a 100% chance of success on A, so we're not even going to discuss that. We're going on to the next. But it turned out to be a good appeals resolution, because as we went along, there were issues that were decided in the taxpayer's favor. And these are done on tax theory. Sometimes laymen would say, well, you're horse trading to try and get this thing resolved. And no, it's not horse trading. There has to be a justification for each one being settled one way or the other.
Okay. Should a taxpayer represent himself or herself at appeals?
Huge mistake. I don't think that's a good idea at all. There are some professionals that don't want the taxpayer even to appear at appeals. I'm a little different with respect to that, in the sense that when a case has been referred to me, I may not know everything about the background in the case, other than the issues that are in front of us. And when you get to appeals, many times the appeals officer will ask questions, and I'll just go, I wasn't there, I don't know. But if the taxpayer is there to give you facts and nothing more than facts, then I'm fine with that. But again, you'll find many professionals that would rather say, okay, what are your questions? I'll get back to my client, and then I'll get back to you. That's a matter of druthers. I haven't been in a situation, I think, where I've been in a circumstance where the case would be compromised by what a client has said, because obviously if the client's going to start going beyond what he's asked, I'm going to put an end to that. But it's something that a taxpayer on his own should not be going to appeals.
Yeah. What happens when there's no satisfactory resolution from the meeting at appeal? So if you can't.
Well, now you're going either to tax court or district court, and what will happen is, if you can't get a resolution, then the appeals officer will issue the report, and also a company letter that gives you 90 days to appeal your case or petition your case to the tax court, which again requires the filing of documents, a petition to the tax court. You can also go to district court, and the difference is that district court's a jury trial, and you have to pay the tax before you get there. And so most people, when they get to the situation of coming to an impasse at appeals, at least in my dealings, you're going to tax court. That's because you don't have to pay to go to tax court, other than the filing fee of $60 that's sent in with your petition.
Okay. So who's licensed to practice in tax court?
Attorneys and CPAs who are licensed to practice tax court. I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be CPAs who are licensed. I think an EA can be licensed to practice in tax court if they pass the examination that the IRS holds in Washington, D.C.
Okay. So then how do you get the case to tax court?
Well, after the petition is filed, then the petition is sent to the tax court at Washington, D.C. It's addressed there. And then you just sit tight, and pretty soon you're going to be contacted by somebody, a regional counsel attorney in San Francisco, because when you file the petition, you have to request the location, and they always give you the location you're wanting. So you'll get contacted for initial meetings with the IRS attorney that's been assigned the case, and what goes on from there is sometimes they will suggest, would you like to go back to appeals for one more crack at it to see if we can't get this thing resolved, and sometimes that can bear fruit and get the matter resolved without having to go through the tax court process. But once you start going through the tax court process, you have pretrial meetings and discovery, and they can get pretty contentious, and it takes a while too for a case to actually get to tax court. I've had situations where you get a case docketed, and which means it's been assigned a tax court number, but the actual trial date has not been set, and wow, we had one that took 13 months from the time it was docketed until finally we called the tax court and questioned, where are we with respect to getting a date? And so it can take some time. These things get very protracted.
Yeah, I mean, I see rulings that come out on, like 10 years or so after a person may have filed a tax return or whatever. I mean, it's...
Well, yeah, I've got a case right now where the tax year was 2003. Mm-hmm. The exam was held in 2006. The appeal was somewhere around 2008. The trial was in 2014, January 2014, and we don't have a decision, and we're coming up to 2016. So
right.
That really can get very protracted, and it's frustrating, I guess, for the tax court personnel and also for the taxpayers. But I guess they're so swamped with the caseload that maybe that should be an alert that the service should be a little more at the agents and exam levels trying to get things resolved because there are cases where you can have an exam, and the next thing that comes from a letter on it is, here's your 90-day letter, you're going to tax court. Well, what happened to appeals and all those things? I mean, certainly you can write to say, put that in your petition, hey, we haven't had a chance to go to appeals, and it will get kicked back. But I think the point I'm making is that maybe they're too quick to the decision that this thing is going to go to tax court.
So the IRS is abbreviating its own procedures.
Right. They're shortcutting procedures that just make it cumbersome all the way through.
Yeah. So some of this relates to the situation we talked a little bit, you and I, privately about that. Basically, the IRS is short-staffed. Mm-hmm. I mean, its budget has been curtailed dramatically, and in fact, the audit rate is down. Statistically, you were telling me that you still seem to be seeing plenty of work, but
Right.
anyway.
Because that's what I do. But
but part of what's going on then is that you don't get, even taxpayers in general, they don't get response from the IRS. So they're saying, I'm trying to remember, but basically that there were hang-ups, like 40% of calls into the Internal Revenue Service. I mean, people are hanging on for 3 hours to try to talk to an agent or a representative of the IRS. And anyway, so there's frustration all the way around, but it seems to me that could be part of what may be behind this abbreviation and trying to abbreviate the process. But the problem is that the taxpayer isn't getting the service that they should be, and now they've got the expense of going to tax court.
Right, that's correct, and that can be a very expensive proposition. So once you get to tax court, or even going through the pre-trial phase, you can have several meetings, and you can have, because of parties not being available, get depositions and those types of things. And we had one case where people were being deposed, and one of the depositions was a very strong support of the taxpayer's position. And so after that particular deposition, we had the feeling that this thing is pretty well resolved. The very next day, I got a call from the IRS attorney, regional counsel, saying, we concede that issue, but now we're going to proceed with an alternative issue that they hadn't raised to that point. So now you start all over again. And we've had that experience. So that's why this thing can kind of get blown way up.
It gets a life of its own.
yeah, you gotta be, and there's no way you can contain that. I mean, if the service is going to do that, you're in for the sleigh ride.
Oh boy. So this is another one that we don't really have as a question, but what about the idea of the taxpayer being able to recoup fees sometimes if the IRS is
right, you
handling
can,
things
but
improperly?
After the thing is over, if the taxpayer has prevailed completely and has shown that the IRS has taken a vexatious, that's the word, vexatious position, then you can recoup fees. But I'd say that's a pretty difficult motion to put in to have success with, because in most cases you're in tax court because the service there feels that there is a legitimate disagreement, and I think that the judges are inclined to think that too, is that the two parties are there because there is a legitimate differences on issues.
Yeah. Well, I've read and heard about a few cases where it sounded, again, it was sort of the abbreviated procedure type thing. The IRS is trying to shortcut, and as a result, in one particular case, they had actually an agreement, a settlement, immediately before the tax court trial. Mm-hmm. The taxpayer went back and petitioned for fees, and the government said, well, we never even got to tax court. But basically, the court ruled, well, procedurally, basically, you guys screwed up, and so we're going to give this person fees.
Right, that can happen. Right,
yeah.
Right. You didn't necessarily have to have the trial to recoup the fees. Yeah.
So we got maybe about 2.5 minutes left. Maybe you can just give us some advice about this idea about going to tax court or litigating a tax case.
Well, there are procedures. I mentioned it's expensive to go to tax court, but there is a small tax case procedure that taxpayers can avail themselves of, and those cases are where the tax proposed for any 1 year is $50,000 or less, and so in those cases you can get a small tax court case in, which is a much easier petition to file, requires less paperwork all the way through. And one of the big things that makes the difference is that when you conclude a trial in a regular tax case, there's a briefing process that is extraordinary. That takes more time than anything, and it's very tedious and difficult on both sides, both for the taxpayer and for the service. On the other hand, if you go to a small tax case, there is no briefing afterwards. The decisions are quick, and in some cases that they're not even heard as before a judge. They're just reassigned to appeals and resolved that way. So if that is a situation where you have tax issues and tax liabilities that are being proposed that are lesser amounts, then small tax case is definitely the way to proceed.
Do you have more limited appeal rights for those cases? Or?
Yeah, they're not appeal. Yeah, that's one thing is that once you have a decision that's unfavorable on a small tax case, you can't appeal it. But I've only had one case where we went to regular tax court and didn't get a complete success. It was appealed before the appellate court, and slam dunk. If you're going to the appellate court, you probably have to have an issue that's of great significance and not just bearing on your particular set of circumstances alone.
Right. Bill, I want to thank you so much for joining me,
not at all.
Sharing some of your knowledge related to this. So folks, the game isn't necessarily over after an audit. You can appeal and possibly go to court. Bear in mind, though, it is an expensive process. So, for small issues, sometimes it's better to just go ahead and pay your money and put it behind you.
If you can get the small tax court, that's a workable alternative.
Yeah, that is. Okay, we'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.